The emergency dispatcher froze mid-keystroke, her coffee cup suspended inches from trembling lips as the voice crackled through the radio with desperate urgency. "She's dying in my arms. I can't lose another child." The caller wasn't reporting a human emergency. Records showed Joseph Whitehorse, age 67, had no living children. Sarah Peterson's headset clattered to the desk as she lunged for the microphone, her chair spinning wildly behind her. Two other dispatchers abandoned their calls, drawn by the raw anguish bleeding through the static. In 30 years of emergency services, none of them had heard such primal desperation. Margaret, the senior dispatcher, pressed her palm against her chest, where her own granddaughter's photo lived in her uniform pocket. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," she whispered, remembering the missing child reports from 3 years ago, the ones that never found resolution. "Send everything," Sarah commanded, her finger stabbing the emergency response button. "Code red to Glacier County, now!" But what kind of child cries with a voice that deep? And why did old Joe Whitehorse sound like he was holding on to his very soul? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that desperate emergency call, Joseph Joe Whitehorse sat in his weathered kitchen chair, speaking softly to the framed photograph of his late wife, Martha. The September morning light filtered through faded curtains, casting gentle shadows across the modest cabin that had been their home for 37 years. At 67, Joe carried the weight of loss in his shoulders, the kind that comes from burying the people who made life worth living. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered to Martha's smiling face, her Cherokee cheekbones prominent even in the old photograph. "Tyler would have started 3rd grade today." His voice cracked slightly as he poured 2 cups of coffee, leaving one untouched on the opposite placemat, a ritual he'd maintained for 2 years since cancer took his beloved wife, and one he'd modified 3 years ago when a drunk driver stole their 7-year-old son. The financial papers scattered across the kitchen table told a story of mounting desperation. Social Security checks of $1,200 barely covered groceries and utilities, let alone the $47,000 the bank demanded to prevent foreclosure. His Cherokee grandfather would have called it the white man's paper trap. Legal documents that could steal a man's land faster than any cavalry charge. Joe's weathered hands, still steady despite his recent heart diagnosis, traced the foreclosure notice's stark black lettering. 90 days. That's all the time left in the place where Martha had hung her grandmother's dream catcher, where Tyler had taken his first steps, where 3 generations of Whitehorse men had called home. The irony wasn't lost on him. A Vietnam War veteran who'd saved countless animals in the field, now unable to save his own sanctuary. His part-time work as a wildlife consultant brought in maybe $300 a month, but pride prevented him from accepting charity. When his neighbor, 70-year-old Sarah Blackwater, brought her weekly casserole, Joe always insisted on paying her something, even when his cupboards held nothing but crackers and instant coffee. The cabin sat 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense Montana wilderness, where black bears wandered freely through ancient trails. Corporate developers had been circling the area like vultures, their glossy brochures promising luxury wilderness experiences for wealthy tourists. Joe had thrown their offers in the trash without opening them. Some things weren't for sale. Every evening, he'd sit on the porch with Martha's coffee cup, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "At my age, every sunrise is borrowed time," he'd tell visitors, though few came anymore. The doctors had diagnosed his heart condition 6 months ago, but expensive treatments were impossible luxuries. He'd made peace with mortality, almost. What Joe hadn't made peace with was the hollow ache of purpose. Martha used to say that a man without something to protect wasn't really living. As autumn approached and hunting season loomed, Joe continued his daily patrols, checking for illegal traps that threatened the wildlife he'd spent decades protecting. He didn't know that fate was preparing to test everything he believed about family, sacrifice, and second chances. Monday morning arrived with the crisp bite of late September, and Joe Whitehorse pulled on his worn leather boots with the methodical precision of a man who'd been walking these woods for 3 decades. The foreclosure notice lay folded in his shirt pocket, a constant reminder that time was running short. His morning patrol had become more than routine. It was his final act of stewardship over land that might soon belong to strangers. The forest seemed unusually quiet as Joe made his way along the familiar deer path, his weathered hands gripping the walking stick Martha had carved for his 60th birthday. After 2 miles of checking his usual spots for illegal hunting traps, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Not the aggressive roar of a territorial bear, but something far more heartbreaking. It was crying. Deep, mournful sounds that seemed to echo with a pain Joe recognized all too well. Following the sound through dense underbrush, Joe pushed aside low-hanging branches until he reached a small clearing where his worst fears materialized. A massive black bear, easily 8 years old and weighing close to 300 pounds, lay trapped beneath the cruel steel jaws of a professional hunting trap. The device wasn't the crude homemade contraptions he usually found. This was military-grade equipment, chained to an oak tree with industrial hardware that spoke of serious money and darker intentions. What stopped Joe's heart wasn't just the bear's obvious suffering, but the distinctive white star-shaped scar on her forehead. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just any bear. This was Hope, the therapy bear who had belonged to Emily Watson, the 8-year-old girl who died in that horrific house fire 3 years ago. The same week they'd buried Tyler. Joe had been one of the volunteer firefighters who'd responded that terrible night. He'd held Emily in his arms as the paramedics worked frantically, her small hand clutching his collar as she whispered her final words. "Promise me. Take care of Hope. She's all alone now, just like me." The little girl had died from smoke inhalation before they reached the hospital, and Hope had vanished into the wilderness that same night, presumably to die of grief like many animals do when they lose their human family. But here she was, 3 years later, trapped and dying in the very forest Joe protected. The bear's intelligent brown eyes met his, and instead of the wild panic he expected, Joe saw something that shattered his heart. Recognition. Hope remembered him from that terrible night. She remembered the man who'd held her little girl as life slipped away. "Hey there, beautiful girl," Joe whispered, his voice breaking as he slowly approached the wounded animal. "I know you remember me. I remember you too." Hope's massive head lifted slightly, and she made a soft, chuffing sound. Not aggressive, but pleading. Her injured leg was swollen beyond recognition, the steel trap having crushed bone and torn through muscle. Infection had already begun to set in, evidenced by the fever in her eyes and the labored breathing that spoke of systemic distress. Joe knelt beside the trap, examining the mechanism with the tactical precision his military training had drilled into him 40 years ago. The locking mechanism was sophisticated, designed to prevent exactly what he was attempting. But Joe had worked on similar devices during his time as an Army veterinarian in Vietnam, where wounded animals often wandered into abandoned military equipment. "I'm going to get you out of here, sweetheart," he promised, his weathered hands already working at the trap's release mechanism. "Emily made me promise, and a Whitehorse never breaks his word." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd failed to save Emily, failed to protect Tyler, failed to save Martha from cancer. But maybe, just maybe, he could save Hope. The bear remained remarkably still as Joe worked, occasionally whimpering but never attempting to bite or claw at him. It was as if she understood that this gruff old man was her only chance at survival. When the trap finally released with a sickening metallic clang, Hope's cry of relief was almost human in its gratitude. Joe quickly assessed the damage. The leg was mangled but salvageable, though infection was spreading rapidly. Hope needed immediate veterinary care, but the nearest wildlife rescue facility was 4 hours away, and they'd likely euthanize her rather than attempt expensive treatment on a wild animal. The legal thing to do would be to call the authorities and let them handle the situation. But as Joe looked into Hope's trusting eyes, he heard Emily's dying words echoing in his memory. This wasn't just any wild animal, this was family. Emily had trained Hope since she was a cub, and the bear had been her constant companion through years of seizures and medical treatments. Hope wasn't truly wild. She was domesticated, abandoned, and alone. "Come on, girl," Joe said, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. "We're going home." The first week of October brought an Indian summer warmth that seemed to mock the gravity of Joe's situation. He'd converted his old barn into a makeshift veterinary clinic, drawing on skills he hadn't used since treating wounded animals in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Hope lay on a bed of clean hay, her massive form rising and falling with each labored breath as antibiotics, purchased with his last $300, slowly fought the infection ravaging her system. "Easy there, sweetheart," Joe murmured, gently changing the bandages on Hope's mangled leg. The bear's amber eyes followed his every movement with an intelligence that still amazed him. She'd learned to trust his touch completely, even allowing him to administer injections without the slightest resistance. More remarkably, Hope had begun displaying behaviors that confirmed Joe's suspicions about her past with Emily. She could open simple latches, responded to basic commands, and had an uncanny ability to sense when Joe's heart condition was acting up, positioning herself protectively beside him during episodes. The financial reality of Hope's care hit Joe like a sledgehammer when Sarah Blackwater stopped by with her weekly casserole. The elderly Blackfeet woman took one look at the veterinary supplies scattered across his kitchen table and let out a low whistle. "Joseph Whitehorse, please tell me you didn't spend your mortgage money on bear medicine." Joe couldn't meet her eyes. "It's complicated, Sarah." "Complicated?" She picked up a receipt for surgical sutures. $8,000 complicated. "Son, that's more than half what you owe the bank." Her weathered face softened as she watched Hope through the barn door, the bear gently mouthing one of Tyler's old stuffed animals that Joe had given her for comfort. "Sweet Lord, she's not wild at all, is she?" "Her name is Hope," Joe said quietly. "She belonged to Emily Watson before—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone in the county remembered the fire that had claimed the little girl's life. "Emily made me promise to take care of her." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the weight of such a promise in their culture. "And the law?" "The law says I'm harboring a dangerous wild animal. Fish and Wildlife would put her down the moment they found out." Joe's voice hardened. "They don't care that she's grieving, that she's been abandoned, that she trusts humans more than her own kind. All they see is liability." That same afternoon, as if summoned by Joe's fears, a black SUV pulled into his driveway. The man who emerged wore expensive hunting gear and carried himself with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Joe recognized the type immediately. Corporate money wrapped in outdoor camouflage. "Mr. Whitehorse?" "I'm Conrad Blackstone, wildlife management consultant." The man's smile was perfect and completely empty. "I understand you've been having some bear problems in this area." Joe's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped beside his door. "No problems here, son. Just minding my own business." "Well, that's interesting," Conrad said, pulling out a tablet and swiping through what appeared to be photographs. Because I've got evidence of a large black bear that's been frequenting residential areas. Dangerous behavior that puts the entire community at risk. He turned the screen toward Joe, showing grainy trail camera footage of Hope drinking from the creek behind Joe's cabin. Joe's blood ran cold. The photos were clearly taken from his property, which meant this stranger had been watching him for days, possibly weeks. "You've been trespassing on my land. Public safety trumps property rights, Mr. Whitehorse. I'm sure you understand." Conrad's voice took on a harder edge. "Now, I'm prepared to handle this situation quietly. Just tell me where the bear is and I'll take care of the problem." "There's no problem to take care of." Conrad studied Joe with calculating eyes. "Let me be frank with you, old man. I know you're harboring that animal illegally. I know you can't afford the fines or legal fees that would come with a federal wildlife violation. And I know you're about to lose this property anyway." He gestured dismissively at the foreclosure notice visible through the kitchen window. "I'm offering you a way out. Cooperate, and I'll make sure the authorities go easy on you." "And if I don't cooperate?" "Then I file my report with Fish and Wildlife tomorrow morning. Federal marshals will be here by afternoon, and your bear will be dead by evening." Conrad's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Your choice, Mr. Whitehorse. Easy way or hard way." Joe felt his chest tighten. Whether from rage or his heart condition, he couldn't tell. "Who are you really working for, son? Because you sure as hell aren't with any wildlife agency I know." Conrad's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Does it matter? What matters is that dangerous animals don't belong in civilized areas. My father learned that lesson the hard way 30 years ago." His voice took on a bitter edge. "Black bear attack left me an orphan at 12 years old. I've been cleaning up their mess ever since. So this is personal." "Everything worth doing is personal, Mr. Whitehorse. You've got until tomorrow morning to make your decision." Conrad climbed back into his SUV, then rolled down the window. "Oh, and Mr. Whitehorse, that bear of yours, she's already caused problems you don't even know about yet. Tomorrow's just the beginning." As the SUV disappeared down the dirt road, Joe sank onto his porch steps, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Hope appeared in the barn doorway, her massive form silhouetted against the afternoon light, and made a soft, chuffing sound that seemed to ask if everything was all right. "I don't know, girl," Joe whispered, his hand finding the foreclosure notice in his pocket. "I honestly don't know." Inside the barn, Hope settled back onto her bed of hay, Tyler's stuffed bear clutched gently in her massive paws. She didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone of defeat in Joe's voice. It was the same tone Emily had used during her final weeks, when the seizures grew worse and the doctors stopped making promises about tomorrow. The escalation began exactly as Conrad Blackstone had promised. By Tuesday morning, a white government vehicle sat in Joe's driveway, and Agent Patricia Coleman from Montana Fish and Wildlife stood on his porch with an official seizure warrant. Her expression was sympathetic but unyielding as she handed Joe the legal documents that would tear his world apart. "Mr. Whitehorse, I'm sorry it's come to this," Agent Coleman said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd delivered too many heartbreaking messages. "We received a report that you're harboring a black bear without proper permits. I need to inspect your property, and if the allegations are confirmed, remove the animal for public safety." Joe's weathered hands trembled as he read the warrant. "What happens to her then?" "Standard protocol is relocation to an appropriate facility if the animal shows signs of human dependency or aggressive behavior." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Both of them knew what happened to problem bears. "She's not aggressive," Joe said quietly. "She's grieving." Agent Coleman's expression softened slightly. "Sir, I understand you may have formed an attachment, but bears aren't pets. Even well-intentioned human contact can make them dangerous to themselves and others." As if summoned by their conversation, Hope appeared in the barn doorway. Agent Coleman's hand instinctively moved toward her radio, but she froze when she saw the bear's behavior. Instead of the defensive posturing she expected, Hope simply sat down and waited, her intelligent eyes moving between the two humans with what looked remarkably like curiosity rather than fear. "Sweet Jesus," Agent Coleman whispered. "How long have you been caring for her?" 3 weeks, Joe admitted, knowing that honesty might be his only hope. "I found her caught in an illegal trap. Her leg was mangled, infected. She would have died if I'd left her. And she just accepts you?" "She's not wild," Joe said, stepping toward Hope. The bear immediately rose and moved to his side, gently pressing her massive head against his hip in a gesture of pure affection. "She belonged to Emily Watson before the fire. She's been trained since she was a cub." Agent Coleman stared in amazement as Hope carefully took Tyler's old toy car from Joe's hand and placed it at the agent's feet, a clear offering behavior that spoke of extensive socialization. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted. "But it doesn't change the law, Mr. Whitehorse. I have to follow protocol." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle. This one carrying Margaret Standing Bear, the environmental lawyer who'd contacted Joe the previous day claiming to offer pro bono assistance. Joe felt a flicker of hope as the Cherokee woman approached with a briefcase full of legal documents. "Agent Coleman, I'm representing Mr. Whitehorse in this matter," Margaret announced with professional confidence. "I have documentation that may change your assessment of this situation." For the next hour, Margaret presented her case with the skilled precision of someone who'd fought similar battles before. She produced Emily Watson's medical records showing Hope's certification as a therapy animal, training documents proving the bear's extensive socialization, and most importantly, what appeared to be a copy of Emily's will naming Joe as Hope's guardian in the event of the family's death. "This is highly irregular," Agent Coleman said, studying the documents carefully. "I've never seen provisions for wildlife inheritance." "Emily Watson was a remarkable child with a progressive family," Margaret explained. "They understood that Hope wasn't just a pet. She was Emily's medical support system. When the family drafted their estate planning, they specifically included provisions for Hope's care." Joe felt a surge of relief as Agent Coleman nodded slowly. "If these documents are authentic, it could change things. I'll need to verify them with the state records office. But if they check out..." She looked at Hope, who was now contentedly organizing Joe's gardening tools with her remarkable dexterity. "I've never seen a bear behave like this. She's clearly not a threat to public safety." "How long will the verification take?" Joe asked. 72 hours, minimum. I'll have to file a stay of execution on the seizure warrant." Agent Coleman's radio crackled with an incoming call. As she stepped away to answer, Margaret moved closer to Joe. "We need to talk privately," she said in a low voice. "There are things about this case you need to know." That evening, after Agent Coleman had left with assurances that Hope would remain undisturbed pending document verification, Margaret revealed the first of many devastating truths. They sat in Joe's kitchen while Hope dozed peacefully in the barn, Tyler's stuffed bear clutched protectively in her massive paws. "The documents I showed Agent Coleman today are real," Margaret began, "but they're not the complete story. Emily Watson's family was more connected than you realize. Her grandfather was Thomas Watson, the Blackfeet tribal elder who's been fighting Pinnacle Development Corporation for the past 5 years. Joe's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "What does that have to do with Hope?" "Everything," Margaret said grimly. "Pinnacle has been trying to acquire this entire valley for a luxury resort development. Your property is the last holdout, the final piece they need. Emily's family refused to sell, just like you have. The fire that killed Emily and her parents wasn't an accident, Joe. It was arson." The words hit Joe like a physical blow. You're saying someone murdered that little girl for land? I'm saying there are people who will do anything to get what they want. And Conrad Blackstone isn't just some wildlife consultant with a personal vendetta against bears. Margaret pulled out a folder containing surveillance photos and corporate documents. He's Pinnacle's cleanup specialist. His job is to eliminate obstacles to development, environmental, legal, or personal. Joe stared at the photos showing Conrad meeting with men in expensive suits, briefcases full of cash changing hands, and most damning of all, Conrad placing illegal hunting traps throughout the forest. He's the one who trapped Hope. Almost certainly. And he's been systematically eliminating wildlife throughout the valley, creating artificial safety concerns that justify clearing the land for development. Margaret's voice hardened. The bear attack that supposedly killed his father, it never happened. Marcus Blackstone committed suicide after Pinnacle destroyed his business and threatened his family. Conrad has been lying about his motivations from the beginning. Then why are you helping me? Joe asked, suddenly suspicious. How do I know you're not working for them, too? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then rolled up her sleeve to reveal a traditional Cherokee tattoo. Because Emily Watson was my niece, she said softly. And because I made a promise to my sister before she died that I would protect Emily's legacy. Hope is part of that legacy. The revelation hit Joe like a thunderbolt. Emily was your family. My sister's adopted daughter. The fire that killed Emily also killed my sister and brother-in-law. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. I've been investigating Pinnacle for 3 years, trying to prove they were responsible. You and Hope are the only witnesses left who can connect Conrad to his crimes. Witnesses to what? Hope was in the house the night of the fire. Emily trained her to be alert to danger, to remember faces and scents. If Hope saw who set that fire? Margaret leaned forward intensely. Bears have incredible memories, Joe. They can recognize human scents years later. As if responding to her name, Hope appeared in the kitchen doorway, her massive form moving with surprising grace. She approached Margaret cautiously, then suddenly became agitated, making low growling sounds that Joe had never heard before. What is it, girl? Joe asked, rising from his chair. Hope moved to the window and reared up on her hind legs, staring out into the darkness. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, the headlights of a vehicle moved slowly along the dirt road, someone conducting surveillance. They're watching us, Margaret whispered. Conrad knows I'm here. The next morning brought news that shattered Joe's fragile hope. Agent Coleman returned with a grim expression and devastating information. Mr. Whitehorse, I'm sorry to report that the documents your lawyer provided appear to be forgeries. The State Records Office has no record of Emily Watson's will containing any provisions for animal guardianship. Joe felt the world tilt beneath his feet. That's impossible. Furthermore, we've received additional complaints about aggressive bear behavior in the area. 3 separate incidents in the past week involving property damage and threatening encounters with hikers. Agent Coleman's voice was sympathetic but firm. I have no choice but to proceed with the original seizure order. Those complaints are fabricated, Margaret protested, but Agent Coleman held up her hand. Ma'am, with respect, you're no longer welcome on this property. The State Bar Association has received a complaint about your practicing without proper licensing. You're under investigation for fraud. Joe watched in horror as his last hope for legal protection crumbled. Margaret was escorted from the property by 2 federal marshals, leaving him alone to face the impossible choice between surrendering Hope to certain death or becoming a fugitive from federal law. That night, as Joe sat with Hope in the barn, sharing one last peaceful moment before the storm, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. We're not going to let them win, girl, he whispered, stroking Hope's massive head. Emily made me promise to take care of you, and a white horse never breaks his word. Hope seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. She gently placed her paw over Joe's heart, where his medication bottle created a small bulge in his shirt pocket. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that transcended species. She knew they were about to run, and she was ready to follow him anywhere. As federal vehicles assembled at the end of his driveway, preparing for the morning seizure operation, Joe and Hope slipped out the back of the barn and into the wilderness that had been their sanctuary. Behind them, the lights of their home faded into darkness, and ahead lay an uncertain future as fugitives from a system that valued corporate profits over love, loyalty, and the sacred promises made to dying children. The hunt was about to begin. The confrontation that would define both their destinies began on Halloween night, as if the universe itself had chosen the most symbolic moment for masks to fall and true faces to be revealed. Joe and Hope had been living like ghosts in the Montana wilderness for 2 weeks, surviving on Joe's military training and Hope's natural instincts. But time was running out in the cruelest possible way. Hope's leg infection had returned with a vengeance, and Joe's heart medication had run out 3 days ago. The irony wasn't lost on Joe as he sat in the abandoned ranger station where they'd taken shelter. Here he was, a man who'd spent his entire life protecting others, now branded as a dangerous fugitive for refusing to abandon the one soul who needed him most. Hope lay beside him, her breathing labored and her massive frame trembling with fever. Without immediate veterinary care, she would die within days. Joe knew that surrendering meant Hope's death, but continuing to run might kill them both. The decision was made for him when Conrad Blackstone's voice echoed through a megaphone from the clearing below. "Joe Whitehorse, I know you're up there. Time to end this charade." Joe peered through the cracked window to see an elaborate setup that spoke of careful planning and unlimited resources. Federal agents, local police, news crews, and what appeared to be a veterinary team, complete with a mobile euthanasia unit. Conrad stood at the center of it all, playing his role as the concerned wildlife expert with practiced perfection. "You've got 10 minutes to bring that animal down here peacefully," Conrad continued, "or we're coming up after you. Think about what's best for everyone involved." Joe felt Hope's massive head press against his thigh, her amber eyes looking up at him with complete trust, despite her obvious pain. In that moment, he understood what Martha had always meant when she said that love wasn't about the time you have, but the time you give. Every choice he'd made, bringing Hope home, nursing her back to health, running into the wilderness, had been about giving her more time, more love, more of whatever goodness still existed in this world. "What do you think, girl?" Joe whispered, stroking Hope's fever-hot fur. "Should we go down there and face the music?" Hope struggled to her feet, swaying slightly from weakness but determined to stand beside him. Her message was clear. Wherever Joe went, she would follow. The walk down the mountain felt like a funeral procession. Joe's heart hammered against his ribs with irregular beats that warned of impending crisis while Hope limped beside him, her proud head held high despite her obvious suffering. As they emerged from the tree line, camera flashes exploded like fireworks, documenting what the media would later call the surrender of the century. Agent Coleman stepped forward, her expression a mixture of relief and regret. "Mr. Whitehorse, you're under arrest for violation of federal wildlife protection statutes. Please step away from the animal." "Her name is Hope," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "And I'm not stepping away from family." Conrad moved closer, his eyes gleaming with anticipated victory. "Mr. Whitehorse, you've caused enough trouble. That animal needs to be put down for public safety, and you need medical attention. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "Public safety?" Joe's voice rose, fueled by righteous anger and failing heart. "You want to talk about public safety? Tell them about the illegal traps you've been setting. Tell them about the families you've destroyed for corporate profit. Tell them about Emily Watson." Conrad's confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man. You're obviously suffering from some kind of breakdown." "Am I?" Joe reached into his jacket pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Instead of the weapon everyone expected, he pulled out a small digital recorder, one of Tyler's old toys that he'd modified with fresh batteries. "Hope has an incredible memory, Conrad. Bears never forget a scent. When you came to my property that first day, she remembered you. She remembered the man who set the fire that killed her family." The clearing fell silent except for the whir of news cameras capturing every word. Conrad's face had gone pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. "This is ridiculous. The ravings of a delusional old man who's been living in the woods too long." "Then explain this." Joe pressed the play button on the recorder. Emily Watson's 8-year-old voice filled the air, crystal clear despite the years that had passed. It was a recording from her therapy sessions, where she'd been learning to communicate with Hope through verbal commands and emotional cues. "Hope, remember the bad man?" Emily's voice said on the recording. "The one who smells like cigarettes and lies. Remember his face? Remember his smell? If you ever see him again, you tell someone. You protect yourself and anyone else he might hurt." The crowd watched in amazement as Hope responded to Emily's recorded voice, moving protectively in front of Joe and fixing Conrad with a stare of unmistakable recognition and hostility. Her behavior was so clearly defensive that even the skeptical reporters began to murmur among themselves. Conrad's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane! You can't trust the testimony of a wild animal." "You're right," said a new voice from the edge of the clearing. Margaret Standing Bear emerged from the tree line, flanked by 2 FBI agents and carrying a briefcase full of documents. "But you can trust DNA evidence, financial records, and surveillance footage." Joe felt a surge of hope as his supposed lawyer, who he now realized had never abandoned him at all, approached with the confidence of someone holding all the winning cards. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced to the crowd, "I'd like you to meet Conrad Blackstone, a.k.a. Marcus Blackwood, a.k.a. Carl Blackwater, depending on which identity he was using for which crime. The FBI has been tracking his activities for 3 years, ever since we connected him to a series of suspicious fires and wildlife killings across 4 states." Conrad's hand moved toward his jacket, but the FBI agents were already in motion. "Conrad Blackstone, you're under arrest for arson, murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism." As the handcuffs clicked around Conrad's wrists, he turned toward Joe with pure hatred burning in his eyes. "You think you've won something here, old man? There are dozens like me. Pinnacle Corporation will get this land one way or another." "Maybe," Joe said quietly. "But not today. And not through hurting innocent creatures." The aftermath unfolded with the swift efficiency of justice finally being served. Agent Coleman, her relief obvious, announced that all charges against Joe were being dropped in light of the new evidence. The illegal traps Conrad had planted throughout the forest were being removed by federal teams. Most importantly, Hope's status was being reassessed under emergency provisions that recognized her unique circumstances as a therapy animal with documented training and socialization. But even as victory seemed within reach, Joe felt his chest tighten with the familiar crushing pain that warned of cardiac crisis. The stress of the confrontation, combined with 2 weeks without medication, had pushed his damaged heart beyond its limits. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath as Hope immediately moved to support him with her massive body. "Medical team!" Agent Coleman shouted, but Joe waved them away with a trembling hand. "Take care of Hope first," he wheezed, his face gray with oxygen deprivation. "She's been sick, needs antibiotics, infection in her leg." "Sir, you're having a heart attack," the paramedic protested. But Joe's grip on Hope's fur was unbreakable. "Promise me," Joe gasped, his eyes finding Margaret in the crowd. "Promise me you'll take care of her." "Emily? Emily made me promise." "I promise," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "But you're going to be fine, Joe." "You both are." As the ambulance doors closed with Joe and Hope inside, the paramedics had quickly realized that separating them would only worsen Joe's condition. The first snow of the season began to fall. Through the ambulance windows, Joe could see reporters interviewing Agent Coleman about the unprecedented case, while FBI agents led Conrad away in chains. Hope lay beside Joe's stretcher, her massive paw gently resting on his arm as monitors beeped frantically around them. Despite her own pain and fever, her attention was focused entirely on the man who'd risked everything to keep a promise to a little girl who'd died 3 years ago. "Hold on, girl," Joe whispered, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. "We're almost home." But as the ambulance raced toward the hospital, both Joe and Hope fighting for their lives, the question remained whether home would still exist when they were strong enough to return to it. The sterile white walls of Glacier Regional Medical Center became the backdrop for a tragedy that would test every bond Joe and Hope had forged in their desperate weeks together. Joe lay unconscious in the cardiac intensive care unit, machines breathing for him while his damaged heart struggled to maintain the rhythm of life. 3 floors below, in the hospital's makeshift veterinary isolation unit, Hope lay equally still, her massive body racked with fever as systemic infection spread through her bloodstream. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the cardiologist who'd taken over Joe's care, delivered the devastating news to Margaret Standing Bear with the clinical precision that came from years of breaking hearts along with delivering medical facts. "Mr. Whitehorse has suffered massive cardiac damage. We've performed emergency surgery to repair what we could, but at his age, with his medical history," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Even if he survives the next 48 hours, he may never regain consciousness." Margaret felt the weight of her promise pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. 3 floors below, Hope was dying of the same infection that should have killed her weeks ago, and the veterinary team was recommending euthanasia as the most humane option. The irony was cruel beyond measure. Joe had saved Hope's life only to watch her slip away while he lay powerless to help. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Whitehorse has been conscious intermittently, and when he is, he keeps asking for hope. His vital signs deteriorate significantly when we tell him she's in isolation and he can't see her." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that medically speaking, separating them might be hastening both their deaths." "I've never seen anything like it, but there appears to be some kind of psychological bond that's affecting their physical recovery." Dr. Martinez glanced around nervously. "Officially, I can't recommend bringing a bear into the ICU. Unofficially, we're running out of conventional options." The next 24 hours brought a parade of medical professionals, lawyers, and bureaucrats, all debating the unprecedented situation while Joe and Hope continued their slow slide toward death. Hope had stopped eating entirely, and the veterinary team reported that she spent her conscious moments staring at the ceiling, as if looking for someone who would never come. Sarah Blackwater, Joe's elderly neighbor, had become an unexpected advocate in the growing media circus surrounding the case. Her weathered face appeared on every local news station as she spoke with the moral authority of someone who'd witnessed a lifetime of both cruelty and kindness. "That man saved my life more times than I can count," Sarah told the reporters gathered outside the hospital. "When my husband died, when I was sick with pneumonia, when the storms knocked out my power for a week, Joe was always there. Now he's dying alone because some bureaucrats can't understand that family doesn't always look the same." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Emily Chen, a pediatric psychiatrist who specialized in therapy animal programs, had been following the case with professional interest. She arrived at the hospital with a briefcase full of research and a determination to challenge every regulation that stood between Joe and hope. "What we're seeing here isn't unusual in the therapy animal world," Dr. Chen explained to the hospital's ethics committee. "The bond between Mr. Whitehorse and Hope represents a documented psychological phenomenon called interspecies attachment disorder. When individuals of different species form primary attachment bonds, separation can cause severe physiological stress that manifests as life-threatening symptoms." The committee members exchanged skeptical glances. "Are you seriously suggesting that a bear is grieving for a human?" "I'm suggesting that grief doesn't recognize species boundaries," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "Mr. Whitehorse and Hope have both experienced significant trauma and loss. They've become each other's primary attachment figures. Continuing to separate them isn't just cruel, it's medically contraindicated." The debate raged for hours while Joe's condition continued to deteriorate. His kidneys were beginning to fail, and the medical team was preparing to discuss end-of-life care with Margaret when a commotion erupted in the hospital corridor. Hope, despite her weakened condition, had somehow escaped from the veterinary isolation unit. Security guards scrambled as the massive bear moved through the hospital with surprising grace and determination, following some instinct that led her unerringly toward the cardiac unit. Panicked staff members called for tranquilizers, but Dr. Chen stepped forward with her hands raised. "Let her go," she said calmly. "She knows where she needs to be." Hope pushed through the ICU doors and made her way directly to Joe's room, her massive form somehow seeming small and vulnerable in the sterile medical environment. She approached his bed cautiously, her amber eyes taking in the tubes and machines that surrounded the man who'd risked everything for her. The moment Hope's massive paw touched Joe's hand, the cardiac monitors began showing changes that amazed the medical staff. His heart rhythm, which had been erratic and dangerous for days, suddenly stabilized. His blood pressure improved. Most remarkably, his eyes fluttered open for the first time in 36 hours. "Hope?" Joe's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of infinite relief. "You're alive." Hope made a soft, chuffing sound and carefully positioned herself beside his bed, her massive head resting gently on his chest. For the first time since the crisis began, both their vital signs showed genuine improvement. But even as hope began to bloom in the ICU, devastating news was arriving from the outside world. Margaret received a call that shattered the fragile peace they'd found in Joe and Hope's reunion. The bank had accelerated Joe's foreclosure proceedings, citing his criminal charges and the publicity surrounding his case as grounds for immediate seizure of his property. "They're moving to demolish the cabin tomorrow," Margaret told Sarah Blackwater as they stood vigil outside Joe's room. "Pinnacle Corporation has already purchased the debt from the bank. They're claiming the property is environmentally contaminated and needs to be cleared for public safety." Sarah's face hardened with the kind of anger that only comes from a lifetime of watching powerful people destroy the powerless. "They can't do that. Joe's not even conscious to defend himself. They can, and they are. By the time Joe is well enough to fight this legally, there won't be anything left to fight for." Inside the ICU room, Joe stirred at the sound of their hushed conversation. Despite his weakened condition, he'd heard enough to understand what was happening. His life's work, his home, his memories of Martha and Tyler, everything was about to be erased while he lay helpless to stop it. "Margaret," Joe called weakly, struggling to sit up despite the protests of nurses. Need to go home." "Joe, you're in no condition to leave the hospital. You've had multiple heart attacks. You need to focus on getting better." Won't be anything left to get better for, Joe said with a clarity that surprised everyone in the room. They're taking everything. The cabin, the land, all of it. His hand found Hope's massive paw, drawing strength from the contact. Can't let them win. Martha's garden, Tyler's treehouse, 40 years of memories. Dr. Martinez stepped forward with the firm voice of medical authority. Mr. Whitehorse, leaving this hospital could kill you. Your heart is barely functioning. Any significant stress or physical activity could trigger another massive cardiac event. Joe looked at Hope, whose amber eyes seemed to hold all the wisdom and sorrow of the world. She'd lost Emily, lost her home, lost everything that mattered to her. Now she was about to lose the man who'd promised to protect her, just as he was about to lose the land he'd promised to protect. Some things are worth dying for, Joe said quietly, his decision made. Home is one of them. As nurses scrambled to prevent what they saw as a suicide mission, and lawyers debated the legal implications of discharging a critically ill patient against medical advice, Hope stood and moved to the window. Outside, the first heavy snows of winter were beginning to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white that looked deceptively peaceful. The final battle was about to begin, and neither Joe nor Hope was strong enough to fight it. But sometimes, the most important battles aren't won through strength. They're won through the simple act of refusing to surrender what matters most. The truth that emerged from Emily Watson's sealed safe deposit box would shake the foundations of everything Joe thought he knew about his desperate fight to save Hope. Margaret Standing Bear sat in the sterile conference room of First National Bank, staring at documents that had been hidden for 3 years, her hands trembling as she realized the magnitude of what Emily's family had orchestrated from beyond the grave. "I don't understand," said the bank president, Harold Michaels, as he reviewed the papers Margaret had just presented. "These documents suggest that Mr. Whitehorse has been the legal owner of his property for 3 years, but our records show he owes $47,000 on his mortgage." "Because those records are fraudulent," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "Emily Watson's family didn't just leave a trust fund for Hope's care. They purchased Joe's entire mortgage from the original lender and forgave the debt as part of their estate planning. The foreclosure proceedings Pinnacle Corporation initiated are based on falsified documents." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Emily's grandfather, Thomas Watson, had been far wealthier than anyone realized. His successful law practice and investments had generated millions, most of which he'd quietly used to purchase land throughout the valley, not for development, but for preservation. Joe's property had been one of his final acquisitions, bought through a shell company to protect it from corporate predators like Pinnacle. "But why Joe specifically?" Harold asked, still struggling to process the implications. Margaret pulled out another document, a handwritten letter from Emily herself, dictated to her mother just weeks before the fire, because Emily knew she was dying. Her seizures were getting worse, and the doctors had stopped making promises about her future. She wanted to ensure that Hope would be cared for by someone who understood loss, someone who would love her unconditionally. The letter, written in a child's careful script, was heartbreaking in its clarity. "Dear Mr. Joe, I know you don't know me very well, but I've been watching you since Tyler died. I see how you take care of the animals in the forest, how you visit Tyler's grave, how you talk to your wife's picture. You understand what it means to love someone even after they're gone. When I die, Hope is going to be very sad and scared. She's going to need someone who knows how to be sad and still choose to love. I think that someone is you. I've asked Grandpa to make sure you and Hope can stay together always. Please don't be mad that we didn't ask first. Sometimes grown-ups make things too complicated, and time is too short for complicated. Love, Emily. As Margaret read the letter aloud, Joe lay in his hospital bed, listening through the speakerphone Margaret had set up so he could participate in the meeting. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he realized that Emily hadn't just saved Hope. She'd saved him too. The little girl he'd held as she died had somehow known that he would need rescuing just as much as her beloved bear. There's more, Margaret continued, pulling out additional documents. The trust fund isn't just $500,000, it's grown to over $2 million in the 3 years since Emily's death. The original will stipulated that if Joe and Hope formed a genuine bond, as assessed by independent animal behaviorists, the full trust would be released to establish a wildlife sanctuary on the property. Hope, who had been lying quietly beside Joe's bed throughout the conference call, suddenly lifted her massive head and made a soft chuffing sound. It was as if she understood that Emily's final gift was being revealed, that the promise made by a dying child was finally being fulfilled. But even as joy began to dawn on Joe's face, Margaret delivered another shocking revelation. "There's something else you need to know, Joe. Something about the night Emily died." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Joe's heart monitor. Margaret took a deep breath before continuing. "Emily didn't die from smoke inhalation like the official reports claimed. She died from an allergic reaction to a sedative that was found in her system, a sedative that the fire department never administered. Someone drugged her before setting the fire, Joe. Someone wanted to make sure she couldn't escape." Joe's heart monitor began beeping faster as the implications sank in. "Conrad, we think so, but we could never prove it. Until now." Margaret's voice hardened with determination. "Hope was in the house that night. She was in Emily's room when the fire started. If what Emily told us about Hope's training is true, if she really can identify threatening individuals by scent and behavior, then Hope is the only living witness to Emily's murder." As if responding to her name, Hope moved closer to Joe's bed and placed her massive paw gently on his arm. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that transcended species, and Joe could see something in them he'd never noticed before. Not just grief, but a deep, abiding anger at the injustice that had taken her little girl away. That's why Conrad was so determined to have Hope killed, Joe realized. Not because she was dangerous to the public, but because she was dangerous to him. Exactly. And that's why Emily's family made such elaborate provisions for Hope's protection. They knew that someday someone would try to silence the only witness to their daughter's murder. The conference call was interrupted by a commotion in the hospital corridor. Dr. Martinez burst into Joe's room with news that changed everything once again. "Joe, you need to see this," she said, wheeling in a television cart. "It's being broadcast on every news station in the country." The screen showed Conrad Blackstone in federal custody, but he wasn't the broken man they'd left in handcuffs just days before. Instead, he was clean-shaven, wearing an expensive suit, and flanked by high-powered attorneys. Worse still, he was giving a press conference. "The charges against my client are politically motivated persecution by environmental extremists," Conrad's lawyer announced to the assembled media. "Mr. Blackstone is a respected wildlife management consultant who was simply doing his job. The so-called evidence against him consists of the unreliable testimony of a man suffering from severe mental illness and the supposed recognition behavior of a wild animal." Conrad stepped forward, his voice smooth and confident. "I want to express my sympathy for Mr. a Whitehorse who is clearly suffering from grief-induced delusions. However, I cannot allow my reputation to be destroyed by the fantasy that a bear can serve as a credible witness to crimes that never occurred." Joe felt his chest tighten with rage as Conrad continued his calculated performance. "The truth is that I've dedicated my life to protecting communities from dangerous wildlife. Mr. Whitehorse's illegal harboring of an unpredictable animal put innocent lives at risk. The real tragedy here is that environmental activists are using this situation to advance their radical agenda. The press conference was clearly orchestrated by Pinnacle Corporation's public relations machine. Conrad's transformation from rough outdoorsman to polished corporate spokesman revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they were facing. This wasn't just about land development, it was about systematically destroying anyone who stood in the way of corporate profits. But as Conrad fielded questions from sympathetic reporters, Hope did something that would change the trajectory of the entire case. She approached the television screen and began displaying the same defensive behavior she'd shown when Conrad first appeared at Joe's cabin, hackles raised, low growling sounds, and positioning herself protectively between the screen and Joe. Dr. Chen, who had been observing Hope's behavior throughout her hospital stay, stepped forward with scientific precision. "This is remarkable. Hope is exhibiting classic stress responses to Conrad's voice, even through electronic reproduction. This level of species-specific threat recognition is unprecedented in the literature." "What does that mean in layman's terms?" Margaret asked. "It means Hope recognizes Conrad as a specific threat, not just as a general human presence. Her behavioral response is consistent with trauma conditioning. She associates his voice, his scent, his physical presence with danger and violence. This isn't trained behavior or coincidence. This is a genuine fear response based on direct experience." Joe watched Hope's distress with growing anger and determination. The bear who had learned to trust again, who had found peace in his care, was being forced to relive the trauma of Emily's murder simply because Conrad appeared on television. "Turn it off," Joe said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Turn it off now." As the television went dark, Hope gradually relaxed, returning to Joe's bedside where she could maintain protective contact. But the damage was done. Conrad's media blitz was already reshaping public opinion, casting doubt on everything they'd fought to prove. "He's good," Margaret admitted grudgingly. "Pinnacle's legal team has turned him from a criminal into a victim of environmental persecution. Without concrete physical evidence linking him to Emily's murder, this becomes a case of competing narratives." Joe closed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. They'd won the battle over Hope's legal status and his property rights, but Conrad was winning the war for public opinion. Soon, the media would lose interest in the story of an old man and his bear, and Conrad would disappear into corporate protection while Emily's murder remained unsolved. "There has to be something," Joe said desperately. "Some piece of evidence that proves what really happened that night." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then looked at Hope with new understanding. "Maybe there is," she said slowly. "Emily was a smart little girl, Joe. She knew she was in danger, knew someone was threatening her family. What if she left us more than just legal documents and trust funds? What if she left us instructions? What kind of instructions? Think about it. Emily trained Hope to remember faces and scents, to identify threats and protect the innocent. But what if that training went deeper? What if Emily taught Hope not just to recognize danger, but to lead others to evidence of that danger?" Joe looked at Hope, who was watching their conversation with the intense focus that had always marked her as extraordinary. "You think Emily hid something? Something that only Hope would know how to find?" "I think Emily was preparing for the possibility that she wouldn't survive to testify against her family's enemies, and I think she made sure Hope would be able to testify for her." As if understanding the conversation, Hope moved to the window and stared out at the snow-covered landscape beyond. Her behavior was purposeful, directed, as if she was looking toward some specific destination that held the key to everything they'd fought for. The final revelation was still to come, but Joe could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. Emily Watson had orchestrated one last surprise from beyond the grave, and hope was the key to unlocking it. Christmas Eve arrived with a blanket of fresh snow that transformed the Montana landscape into something from a Norman Rockwell painting, but for Joe Whitehorse, it marked the first anniversary of the most profound transformation of his life. He stood on his newly renovated porch, watching Hope play in the snow with a group of children from the local special needs program, her massive form gentle and patient as tiny hands explored her thick winter coat. The Emily Watson Wildlife Sanctuary stretched across 200 acres of pristine wilderness, funded by the trust that had grown to nearly $3 million through careful investment and an outpouring of donations from around the world. Joe's story. The Vietnam veteran who'd risked everything to honor a dying child's promise had captured hearts across the globe, generating support that exceeded even Emily's most optimistic projections. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," said Sarah Blackwater, joining Joe on the porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. At 71, she'd become the sanctuary's assistant director, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she helped care for the dozens of rescued animals that now called the property home. Joe accepted the coffee gratefully, his heart stronger now thanks to the experimental treatment Emily's trust had funded. The same money that had saved Hope's life had ultimately saved his as well, just as Emily had somehow known it would. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime," he admitted. "Other times it feels like yesterday that I found her in that trap." The trap that had started it all now sat in a place of honor in the sanctuary's visitor center, its cruel steel jaws permanently welded shut and surrounded by photographs documenting Conrad Blackstone's eventual conviction. The evidence Hope had led them to, Emily's hidden camera and journal buried beneath the charred remains of her family's home, had provided the forensic proof needed to link Conrad to the arson and murder. His corporate handlers at Pinnacle Development had quickly disavowed him once the evidence became public, leaving him to face justice alone. "She knew, didn't she?" Sarah asked, nodding toward where Hope was carefully allowing a wheelchair-bound boy to braid ribbons into her fur. "Emily knew exactly what would happen," Joe smiled, remembering the final entry in Emily's journal that Hope had led them to discover. "If you're reading this, it means Hope found someone who loves her like I do. She's very smart and very good at keeping secrets. The man who hurt my family thinks he's won, but Hope remembers everything. She'll show you where I hid the truth when the time is right." Love finds a way, even when people try to stop it. The truth Emily had hidden was more than just evidence of Conrad's crimes. Her camera had captured months of surveillance footage showing Pinnacle Corporation's systematic harassment of families who refused to sell their land. The company's stock price had plummeted when the evidence became public, leading to congressional investigations and new federal protections for rural communities facing corporate pressure. "Mr. Joe," called out Maria Santos, an 8-year-old girl with autism who'd formed a special bond with Hope. "Look what Hope can do." Joe watched in amazement as Hope responded to Maria's hand signals, a modified version of sign language that Emily had taught her years earlier. The bear carefully picked up specific colored blocks and arranged them in patterns that Maria requested, her massive paws displaying a dexterity that never failed to astound visitors. Dr. Emily Chen, who now served as the sanctuary's research director, approached with her tablet full of behavioral data. "The children's progress has been remarkable," she reported. "Hope's ability to provide emotional support and sensory regulation for kids with special needs is beyond anything we documented in the literature." "Emily would be proud," Joe said softly, his eyes misting as he watched Hope gently nuzzle a shy boy who'd been struggling with selective mutism since his parents' divorce. Under Hope's patient encouragement, the child had begun speaking again, first to the bear, then, gradually, to the human staff. The sanctuary had become more than just a home for rescued wildlife. It was a healing place where children who'd experienced trauma could find hope, where elderly volunteers like Sarah discovered new purpose, and where the boundary between human and animal care dissolved into something larger and more meaningful. Margaret Standing Bear emerged from the main house carrying a stack of legal documents and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just won another impossible case. "Good news," she announced. "The state legislature just passed the Emily Watson Act. It's now illegal in Montana to use false environmental claims to pressure landowners into selling their property." "And the other sanctuaries?" Joe asked, referring to the network of wildlife preserves that Emily's trust was funding across the country. 12 operational, 8 more in development. We're creating a nationwide network of safe havens for both animals and the communities that protect them. Margaret's voice carried the pride of someone who'd helped transform a dying child's dream into a living legacy. As the afternoon light began to fade, the visiting families gathered in the sanctuary's main hall for the Christmas Eve celebration that had become tradition. Hope moved among the crowd with the grace of a therapy animal who understood her role perfectly, offering comfort to a veteran struggling with PTSD, providing a calming presence for an overstimulated child, and somehow knowing exactly where she was needed most. Joe found himself standing before the memorial wall dedicated to Emily Watson, a collection of photographs, artwork, and letters from the thousands of lives that had been touched by her story. In the center hung Emily's own self-portrait, painted during her final weeks, showing a small girl holding hands with a massive bear under a sky full of stars. "You kept your promise, sweetheart," Joe whispered to the painting. "Hope is safe, loved, and helping other kids just like you wanted." As if summoned by his words, Hope appeared beside him, her massive head pressing gently against his leg in the gesture of affection that had become their private language. In her mouth she carried Tyler's old toy car, the one Joe had given her during those first desperate days of their bonding. She'd claimed it as her own treasured possession, carrying it with her wherever she went. "And you kept your promise too, didn't you, girl?" Joe said, scratching behind Hope's ears. "You brought an old man back to life." The evening's program featured presentations from the children who'd participated in the sanctuary's therapy programs. Maria Santos, now confident enough to speak to large groups, told the audience about how Hope had taught her to be brave. Other children shared artwork inspired by their animal friends, stories about overcoming fears, and songs they'd learned about the connections between all living things. But the most moving moment came when 10-year-old David Miller, the boy who'd been silent for months after his trauma, stepped forward with a letter he'd written to Emily Watson. His small voice grew stronger as he read, "Dear Emily, I never met you, but I know you're my friend because you saved Hope, and Hope saved me. When bad things happened to my family, I thought I would never be happy again. But Hope showed me that love doesn't end when people go away. It finds new places to live. Thank you for teaching Hope to help kids like me. I think you would like to know that we're all taking good care of each other." As applause filled the room, Joe felt a hand slip into his. Sarah Blackwater stood beside him, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Around them, families who'd been brought together by loss had created something new. A community bound not by blood or geography, but by the understanding that healing happens when broken souls choose to care for other broken souls. "Martha would have loved this," Sarah said softly. "She's here," Joe replied with quiet certainty. "They all are. Martha, Tyler, Emily. They're in every life that's been changed, every child who's learned to hope again, every animal that's found safety." He looked down at Hope, who was now surrounded by children singing a lullaby Emily had taught her. Love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to grow. As midnight approached and Christmas Day dawned, Joe sat in his favorite chair with Hope's massive head resting on his lap. The sanctuary was quiet now, filled with the peaceful sleep of creatures who'd found their way home. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white that promised new beginnings. 3 years ago, Joe had been a broken man preparing to die alone. Tonight, he was surrounded by family. Not the family he'd lost, but the family he'd found by choosing to honor a little girl's dying wish. Some angels have wings, he reflected, watching Hope's gentle breathing. His had paws, and she'd taught him that the most powerful force in the universe isn't death or loss or corporate greed, it's love. And love always finds a way. Sometimes life takes everything you thought mattered, your spouse, your children, your home, your purpose, and leaves you wondering if there's any point in continuing. Joe Whitehorse knew that darkness intimately. At 67, broke and broken-hearted, he was just marking time until his damaged heart finally gave out. But then, fate placed a dying bear in his path, and everything changed. What started as honoring a little girl's final wish became something miraculous, proof that it's never too late to build a new family, discover a new purpose, and create a legacy that touches countless lives. Joe didn't just save Hope. She saved him right back, showing him that love doesn't retire, purpose doesn't have an expiration date, and the most meaningful chapters of our lives often begin when we think the story is ending. The Emily Watson Wildlife Sanctuary stands today as testament to what happens when someone refuses to give up on love, even when love seems to have given up on them. Every rescued animal, every healed child, every transformed life proves that our greatest contributions often come not from our strength, but from our willingness to care for others when we're at our weakest. Have you ever discovered unexpected purpose during your darkest moments? What hope has entered your life when you needed it most? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how love found new ways to grow in your life.